Hi everyone. In today's video, I just wanted to go through the three different meninges that are part of the central nervous system, and specifically in the brain and the spinal cord. So firstly, I'll just introduce you to what the meninges actually are. So there are three main roles of the meninges, and they are as follows. Firstly, the meninges are able to allow for the protection and covering of the CNS. So what does this mean? This basically means that as there are three separate layers that essentially cover all aspects of the brain and spinal cord, they are able to allow for mechanical and to some extent chemical protection against the outside forces of the body, such as trauma. The second role is that they contain cerebrospinal fluid and therefore allow for the protection of blood vessels and the enclosing of venous sinuses. So, in this case, the cerebrospinal fluid is actually present in a layer called the arachnoid mater, and specifically in the subarachnoid space. So the protection of blood vessels is through this essentially liquid structure that allows for lubrication and liquid protection of the brain, and also fills the sinuses and essentially allows for protection of these sinuses as the CSF is able to pass through them. And other meninges that assist the CSF, including the arachnoid mater, are able to allow for structural protection of the venous sinuses. The third role of the meninges are that they allow for partitions in the skull. And as we all know, the body is a highly organized machine, essentially, and therefore allowing for partitions allows for specialization and compartmentalization, and therefore ensures that the body is able to work smoothly and effectively. So let's go through all three of these meninges in greater detail. Firstly, we have the dura mater. Now, the dura mater is the most superficial meninx. Meninx, I'll just write it out, is the singular form of meninges. So it's the most superficial. Meninx. And it's also the strongest. If we were to look at the brain, for example, so if I were to just draw a rough drawing of the brain, this being the main cerebrum, and this being the brainstem leading downwards, with the cerebellum sort of jutting off here, the dura mater actually covers this part of the brain and continues down into the spinal cord. Now, there are two main layers that the dura mater consists of. There's the periosteal layer that attaches to the inner surface of the skull, and the meningeal layer. That's the true external covering of the brain. Now, there's a big difference that must be first established between the periosteal layer and the meningeal layer. Firstly, the periosteal layer is a part of the double-layered dura mater that is only present in the cranial cavity. So if we were to denote it as this yellow color, the periosteal layer would only be present basically in the brain area. On the other hand, the meningeal layer is present in both the spinal cord, or covering the spinal cord, and covering the brain. That's why we say actually that the dura mater is a bilayer meninx. So it will look something like that, with the meningeal layer going down into the spinal cord, and the periosteal layer staying up in the cranial cavity. So this is what basically allows for structural and mechanical protection of the brain, and it's the most superficial layer. The next layer, that is just present deeper to the dura mater, is called the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid mater is quite unique in its structure, as it's essentially a very undense, or it's not dense at all, and contains cerebrospinal fluid within its bilayered structure. So essentially, between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, there's a space called the subdural space, and this is essentially a very thin serous cavity. However, below the arachnoid mater, we have what's called the subarachnoid space. Now, this subarachnoid space contains the cerebrospinal fluid. So if we were to take sort of like a cross-section of all of the meninges, we would have the fibrous connective tissue of the bilayered dura mater, denoted in black here. Then we would have a very narrow serous cavity, and the red will denote the arachnoid mater. This arachnoid mater is quite thick, and the space that lies between these two red lines is called the subarachnoid space. And this subarachnoid space actually contains cerebrospinal fluid. So this spinal fluid will continuously be floating around the subarachnoid space. It also contains blood vessels that run along either one of the surfaces of the arachnoid mater. And these blood vessels may just be the ones that serve the brain, or are passing from one part of the brain to another, and are quite essential and therefore should be able to be protected. Also, the subarachnoid space contains what we call arachnoid trabeculae. These are sort of cobweb-like structures that exist within that exist between the two sides of the arachnoid mater, and essentially just allow for the suspension of the brain in the skull and allow it to move around. So these arachnoid trabeculae are also assisted in the, I guess, structure of keeping the brain suspended and movement of cerebrospinal fluid with the arachnoid villi. Now, what I've drawn here, which I'll draw a little bit larger just below, is the arachnoid villus. And there are many of these in the arachnoid space. And essentially, their role is to allow for the drainage of cerebrospinal fluid into them and out into the venous sinuses, so that it can be constantly pumped in and out to ensure that it's constantly flowing and that different parts of the brain are able to receive the particular hormones or nutrients that are required for the homeostatic function of the brain. So these arachnoid villi are essentially absorbing the cerebrospinal fluid into the venous blood of the sinuses. There are also various stereocilia in this subarachnoid space, and these stereocilia assist in the movement of cerebrospinal fluid along the subarachnoid space. The final meninx that I would like to go through today, which is the deepest meninx of the cranial cavity and also spinal cord, is the pia mater, also called the pia mater. Now, the pia mater is actually quite delicate, and it is connective tissue like the dura mater. However, it's richly invested with tiny blood vessels. As you saw here, this part of the arachnoid mater is actually the border or the start of the pia mater. So as blood vessels lie on this pia mater, it's richly invested and has blood vessels connected within it. Now, this pia mater is quite unique in its structure as well, as because it's so delicate, it actually clings quite tightly to the brain. So if the brain, say for example, we took a section of the brain, and these were the various gyri and sulci that are present on the surface of the brain, the pia mater would actually quite readily adhere to all of these different shapes on the brain and closely contour it like cellophane. And in fact, this contouring is so close that the various blood vessels that pass from the subarachnoid space into the brain actually take small amounts of the pia mater with them into the brain for a small distance. So a blood vessel would actually carry some of the pia mater into the brain. So these are the three different meninges that are present in the cranial cavity and spinal cord. The three main roles is for the protection of the CNS, protection of the blood vessels and venous sinuses, and to form partitions in the skull. The most superficial is the dura mater, also called the hard mother, and is double layered in that it contains the periosteal layer, which is only present in the cranial cavity, and the meningeal layer, which is present in the cranial cavity and the spinal cord. The arachnoid mater, on the other hand, is quite interesting in that it contains a subarachnoid space where CSF can flow, arachnoid trabeculae, which suspend the brain within the cranial cavity, arachnoid villi, which are able to allow for the drainage of CSF, and stereocilia, which allow for the movement of CSF. Finally, there's the pia mater. The pia mater is quite thin, it closely follows the contours of the brain, and is richly invested with blood vessels. And the blood vessels that pass into the brain actually take some of the pia mater with them for a very short distance. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.